Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling something that might sound a bit dry at first, corporate deposits in India, but stick with us because this deep dive is all about understanding how companies in India can actually use deposits as a way to raise money.
Yeah, and we're going beyond just skimming the surface here. We're using a chapter from an Indian legal textbook. It's all about corporate law, and it's going to be our guide for this deep dive.
Now, I know what you might be thinking. Legal textbooks. Sounds thrilling. But trust me, this stuff can get really interesting because it's all about understanding what actually counts as a deposit in this context, who can accept them, and all the rules surrounding them.
Think of it like this. If you're even thinking about investing in India or just trying to understand how businesses operate there, this is essential knowledge.
Okay, let's break it down. First things first. What exactly is a deposit in this context?
You might think it's straightforward, like you put money in, you get it back later, maybe with some interest. But the Companies Act of 2013, which governs this whole thing, has a surprisingly broad definition.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How broad are we talking here?
Well, it's not just about money sitting in a bank account.
Yeah.
According to Section 231 of the Act, a deposit can be any money a company receives that is considered a deposit, a loan, or even, get this, received in any other form.
Hold on, any other form. So it's not just straight up cash. It could be, I don't know, a herd of sheep.
Not quite. But you're getting at the key point here. It's broader than you might initially think. The important thing is that the repayment of these deposits, it has to be time-bound, meaning there's an actual set date when it has to be returned. And they can be secured or unsecured, meaning there may or may not be assets backing them up.
Okay, so more complex than just dropping some cash in a piggy bank.
Yeah.
But are there any exceptions to this? Things that maybe we think are deposits but actually aren't according to this law?
Absolutely. The Companies Act actually carves out 18 specific categories of funds that don't count as deposits.
18. Whoa, okay. So let's dive into a few of those just to give our listeners a sense of how this all works in practice.
Certainly. Let's start with something pretty straightforward. Money received from the government or anything with a government guarantee, those aren't considered deposits.
Makes sense. The government is generally considered to be pretty reliable. What else?
Well, here's one that's relevant for global business. Money from foreign sources. As long as it follows foreign exchange laws, it also gets a pass.
Interesting. So even though it's money coming into an Indian company, it's treated differently because of its origin. What other intriguing exceptions are on this list?
Well, here's one that you might actually encounter in your own life. Say you pay a company in advance for goods or services they're supposed to provide within a year. That's not considered a deposit.
Unless, of course, the company pockets your money and disappears. Then I'd imagine it suddenly becomes a very problematic deposit.
Exactly. And the law is designed to protect against those shady situations.
Ooh.
And speaking of exceptions, there are special rules for startups, especially when it comes to those trendy convertible notes.
Convertible notes. Those are the investments that can turn into company shares later, right?
You got it. So if a startup receives a convertible note worth at least 25 lakh rupees in a single go, it's not classified as a deposit, even though it's a significant chunk of change.
So the law is trying to make it a bit easier for startups to attract funding. Okay, now that we have a clearer picture of what qualifies as a deposit, let's talk about who can actually accept these deposits. Is it just open season? Can any company in India just accept deposits?
Not at all. The rules around who can accept deposits are pretty strict, and they really depend on whether we're talking about a private company or a public company.
Right. Private companies are usually smaller with shares that aren't traded publicly, while public companies have their shares listed on a stock exchange where anyone can buy them.
Exactly. Now, private companies, they're limited. They can only accept deposits from their own members, and even then, there are specific rules they need to follow.
So if I'm just a regular investor, I can't just walk into any private company and hand over my money hoping to get it back with interest later.
Precisely. You have to be a member of that company, meaning you have some ownership stake in it. Public companies, on the other hand, they have the potential to accept deposits from the general public. But there's a catch.
There's always a catch. What is it this time?
They need to meet certain criteria to become what's called an eligible company.
Yeah.
And it's not easy.
Eligible company sounds exclusive. What does it take to earn that title?
Think of it like a VIP club for financially sound companies. First, they need to have a net worth of at least 100 crore rupees or a turnover of at least 500 crore rupees.
Whoa, those are some serious numbers. So we're talking about well-established, financially solid companies, no fly-by-night operations allowed.
Right. And that's not all. The company also needs to pass a special resolution in a general meeting, basically declaring their intention to accept deposits. and then file that resolution with the registrar of companies.
So it's a deliberate and transparent process, not something they can just decide to do on a whim.
Exactly. It's all about protecting the public and making sure only companies with a proven track record and financial stability can actually access this type of funding.
Makes sense. So let's say a company, whether public or private, has jumped through all these hoops and is allowed to accept deposits. What kind of rules and regulations do they have to follow then?
Oh, there are plenty. The Companies Act lays out a whole framework designed to protect both the companies and the people giving them deposits.
Let's dive into some of those key requirements, the ones that really stand out.
Well, first off, whether they're dealing with members or the public, companies can't just quietly accept deposits. They have to issue circulars or advertisements laying out all the terms and conditions and file these with the registrar of companies.
So no backroom deals or handshake agreements. Everything has to be documented and above board. I like it. What else?
Another important requirement is setting up what's called a deposit repayment reserve account.
What's that all about?
Think of it as a safety net. Companies have to set aside at least 20% of the deposits that are due to mature in the next financial year in a separate bank account. This ensures they actually have the funds to repay depositors when the time comes.
Smart. It's like a mandatory savings account, preventing companies from using those funds for anything else. So it's not just about having the money eventually, it's about having it ready to go when repayment is due.
You got it. And of course, a company can't have any history of defaulting on previous deposits. That's a major red flag.
Makes sense. Who would trust a company with their money if they have a track record of not paying people back?
Exactly. Then there's the requirement to appoint a trustee for depositors, especially when dealing with secure deposits.
So there's someone specifically looking out for the interests of the people who've put up the money. What kind of responsibilities does this trustee have?
Oh, their role is crucial. They make sure the company sticks to the deposit agreement and acts in the best interests of the depositors. They also have to call for meetings of depositors if there's a default or any event that could potentially harm their interests.
Wow, so they have some real power. It's not just a symbolic position. What are the qualifications to even be a trustee?
Well, there are strict criteria. For instance, they can't be a director or employee of the company or have any financial ties that could compromise their impartiality.
Yeah.
We need someone truly independent looking out for those depositors.
Makes sense. What other rules come into play?
Well, there are limits on how long a deposit can last, typically between 6 to 36 months, though there are exceptions for short-term needs.
So I can't just deposit my money for like 50 years and expect to get it back with interest then.
Not quite.
Yeah.
There are also limits on the total amount of deposits a company can accept based on their financial position.
Right, so they can't just take on unlimited amounts of deposits, even if they are technically eligible. What about the interest rates? Are those regulated too?
Absolutely. There's a ceiling on interest rates and brokerage fees, which is tied to the Reserve Bank of India's guidelines for non-banking financial companies.
So there are limits to how much companies can profit from these deposits. It's not a completely free market. Are there any other regulations we should be aware of?
Oh, there are a few more, but let's save those for after a quick break. We'll be back in a moment to continue our deep dive into the fascinating world of corporate deposits in India.
All right, we're back. And before the break, we were really getting into the nitty-gritty of regulations around corporate deposits in India. It's like a whole legal ecosystem.
It really is. And there are even rules about joint deposits, like, nominations, who gets the money if something happens to the depositor,
Yeah.
and how those deposit receipts are issued and tracked. Everything's meticulously documented in a register. They really thought of everything.
It's like a legal thriller with all these rules and safeguards and potential consequences. But this brings up another question. What happens if, despite all these precautions, things go wrong? What if a company just can't repay a deposit?
Well, in that case, the depositor isn't just left hanging. They have legal recourse. They can actually apply to the National Company Law Tribunal, or NCLT for short, for an order demanding the company pay up, including any losses incurred due to the non-payment.
So there's a system in place to hold these companies accountable. What about consequences for the companies or their leaders if they break these deposit rules?
Let's just say there's a lot of motivation to follow the rules. We're talking heavy fines and even imprisonment for officers found guilty of violating the regulations. And if there's evidence of intentional deception or fraud, the penalties can be even more severe.
Wow. So the Indian legal system is not messing around. They're really trying to create a culture of compliance and protect those depositors.
Absolutely. And remember how we mentioned that this act came into effect in 2013? Well, they even addressed what would happen to deposits accepted before the new rules kicked in.
Oh, right, Section 7. So what happened to those pre-2014 deposits?
Basically, companies that had accepted those older deposits were given a deadline to report all the details to the Registrar of Companies, including outstanding amounts and repayment plans. Then they had a limited time to either repay those deposits in full or get an extension from the NCLT if they could justify it.
So even deposits taken under the old rules were brought under the umbrella of this new law. No one got a free pass.
Precisely. It was all about creating a level playing field and making sure everyone was operating under the same set of
This
rules.
is fascinating. It shows how much thought went into crafting this law to ensure that it's comprehensive and effective.
And it highlights how India is trying to balance the needs of companies to raise funds with the need to protect investors and create a stable financial system.
It's like they're trying to strike a balance between encouraging economic growth and protecting the people who are fueling that growth.
Exactly. And there's one more interesting aspect of this legal framework that's worth mentioning. Our source material points out that if there's ever a question about whether the deposit rules apply in a specific situation,
Who gets to make the final call? Is it up to the courts to decide?
not in this case. The Companies Act gives that authority to the central government in consultation with the Reserve Bank of India. They have the final say.
So it's a collaborative effort between the government and the central bank to make sure the rules are applied consistently and fairly across different companies and situations.
Exactly. It's a recognition that sometimes you need a bit of flexibility and expert judgment to navigate these complex financial scenarios.
Before we started this depth dive, I honestly had no idea how much complexity was involved in something as seemingly straightforward as a corporate deposit.
Yeah, it's easy to assume it's just a simple transaction. But as we've seen, there are layers of regulations, safeguards, and even potential pitfalls to be aware of. It's a reminder that even in seemingly simple financial transactions, there's often more than meets the eye.
It's like those optical illusions where you think you're seeing one thing, but then you realize there's a whole other image hidden beneath the surface.
That's a great analogy. And it highlights why it's so important to do your due diligence, whether you're an investor considering a deposit or a company thinking about using deposits as a funding source.
Totally. Understanding the rules of the game is crucial for everyone involved.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power, and in the world of finance, it's also a shield against potential risks.
Okay, so we've unpacked a lot of dense legal information, but let's bring this back to our listener for a moment. Why should they care about all this? What's the big takeaway?
That's the crucial question, right? What does this all mean for someone navigating the financial landscape, particularly in India? Well, there are a few key things to keep in mind.
Let's break it down.
If you're thinking about investing in India, especially in companies that offer these deposit schemes, it's absolutely vital to do your research. Don't just rely on glossy marketing materials or promises of sky-high returns.
Right, because as we've learned, not all deposits are created equal, and there are strict rules about who can accept them and under what conditions. You really need to know what you're getting into.
Exactly. Look into the company's financial health, their track record with repayments, and the specific terms and conditions of the deposit offer. Ask questions. Be informed.
And what if you're on the other side of the equation? What if you're part of a company that's considering using deposits as a way to raise money?
Then buckle up and get ready to dive deep into the Companies Act, 2013, and the deposit rules. Knowing the basics isn't enough. You need to understand the nuances, the exceptions, and the potential consequences of noncompliance.
Because as we've seen, those consequences can be severe. We're talking fines, reputational damage, and even legal action against individuals.
It's not something to take lightly. Compliance isn't just about avoiding penalties. It's about building trust with your investors and operating with integrity.
It's about playing by the rules and contributing to a healthy and stable financial system.
Precisely. And this deep dive has really highlighted the importance of transparency and accountability in the world of corporate finance.
It's a reminder that even in something as seemingly technical as corporate deposits, there are important ethical considerations at play.
Absolutely. And that brings us to a final thought-provoking question for our listener. Knowing all of this, how might this change your perspective? Whether you're an investor or part of a company, how might this knowledge about corporate deposits in India actually shape the decisions that you make?
It's definitely a lot to consider. I mean, we've gone from a simple definition of a deposit to this deep dive into the Indian legal system and how it really impacts businesses and investors. It feels like a crash course in corporate finance.
Yeah, and we've only just scratched the surface here. There are so many layers to this topic, but even this glimpse can be really empowering for people.
I totally agree. It's like we've been given a behind-the-scenes tour of how this whole system works with all its safeguards and complexities.
And, even though we've been focusing on the technical details, the rules and regulations, it's sparked a bigger question for me.
Oh, yeah, I know exactly what you mean. It's like seeing the intricate workings of a watch, and then I'm wondering, what's the point of all this precision? What's the ultimate goal here?
Exactly. Like, what's the underlying message? What's the real spirit of all of these regulations? I think it really boils down to trust. They're trying to create a financial environment where both companies and investors can operate with confidence, knowing that there are rules in place to protect everyone's interests.
It's like setting clear boundaries, like ground rules for a game.
Yeah.
Everyone knows what's allowed, what's not, and what happens if you break the rules. It creates a level playing field.
Precisely. And that sense of fairness encourages both companies and investors to participate more actively. Companies know they need to follow the rules to actually access funding, and investors feel secure knowing those rules are there to protect them.
So it's not just about avoiding penalties, it's about creating a system where everyone feels confident and protected, a system that promotes responsible behavior from both sides.
Absolutely. And that's where things get really interesting,
Yeah.
because laws and regulations can only go so far.
Yeah.
Ultimately, it's up to individuals and companies to really internalize these principles of trust, transparency, and accountability.
It's like having the best set of rules in the world, but if no one actually follows them in spirit, then the whole system falls apart.
That's a great point. It's about moving beyond just ticking the boxes and really embracing these values. It's
Yeah.
about companies actually using deposits ethically and investors taking responsibility for their own financial decisions,
Yeah.
doing their research and asking questions.
Right. It's about recognizing that true stability comes from responsible actions and ethical decision-making from everyone involved.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So, to wrap things up here, we've taken this really dense legal chapter and turned it into something hopefully a little more digestible, a little more insightful, and maybe even a little bit entertaining.
Yeah, we've explored the what, the who, the how, and the why of corporate deposits in India. It's a system with a lot of moving parts, but ultimately it's designed to protect everyone involved and create a more stable and trustworthy financial landscape.
We've covered the key takeaways, but as always, we really encourage you to dive deeper into the source material. We've included links to the chapter we discussed and some other helpful resources in the show notes.
And as you continue your own exploration of the financial world, you know, remember the key principles we've uncovered today: transparency, accountability, and trust. They're the foundation of a healthy and thriving financial system.
Well said. Now, I'm curious, what are your thoughts on all of this? How will you use this new knowledge to navigate the world of investing? Let us know. And join us next time when we'll delve into a topic that's a bit more, well, let's just say it involves algorithms, ethics, and maybe even a touch of existential dread. Intrigued? We'll see you then.